Well, a couple of weeks ago in our series of Little Legends of the Bible, that is, those characters who appear for maybe just a couple of chapters and then we never hear from again, a couple of weeks ago we heard about Hannah. She was childless. She prayed for a son, which God granted to her. We saw her remarkable faith, and we saw how she dedicated that son that she was given to the service of the Lord. The name of that boy was Samuel. That's where the name for the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd, come from. Well, chapter 25 that we're looking at today, you might have noticed, begins with Samuel's death. So what's happened in the meantime, right? We've had Hannah, we've had Samuel, but what's happened in between? We'll just briefly look at the context together. Samuel was called to serve the Lord, and he is the last of the judges of Israel. He calls the people to put away idols and their foreign gods, and to trust in the Lord during their struggles against the nearby nation of the Philistines. And there's a great revival that occurs through the ministry of Samuel. The people repent of their sin, and Samuel leads God's people for most of his life. But then, the Israelites start to ask for a king, because all the other nations around them, they had kings. So we want one too. And, well, eventually, a king is appointed, Saul. And he starts so well. But it all goes terribly wrong. He fails to obey God. He rejects God's word. He rejects God's commands. And so a new man is chosen to be king. David, anointed by Samuel to be king after Saul. And David is, well, just a shepherd boy at first, but swiftly becomes this mighty warrior. They say that Saul has killed his thousands. David has killed tens of thousands, right? He's a superlatively great leader. And Saul is very jealous. And he seeks to kill David. And David has to flee from place to place, and a group of men follow him. Saul is determined to find and kill David, but David, despite having every opportunity to do so, refuses to harm the Lord's anointed, refuses to harm Saul. And so it's while David is going from place to place that we find this passage in 1 Samuel 25. He's fleeing from Saul, and Samuel has died. And David has a number of young men in tow. So here's the plan. For the next few minutes, we're going to have an overview of this narrative from 1 Samuel 25. We'll look at the overarching narrative, and then we're going to go back through it into a few areas in a bit more detail and see what we can learn from our little legend for this week, Abigail, and what can we learn from her. So let's begin then at the start of the chapter. 1 Samuel chapter 25, verse 1. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him. And they buried him at his house at Ramah. So this is the immediate context. There's been this funeral for this last great judge, last great leader of God's people. And David and his men, they travel into the wilderness, a place that's suitable for sheep and goats, but not really very much else. And it's here that we meet two new faces. Look at verse 2. And there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. Well, what a mismatched pair we have here. The name Nabal is probably not his actual name. This is a name that he would have been known by, and we can be pretty confident of this because Nabal means fool or foolish. Not that there's many mothers who would name their children fool deliberately. So it seems to be a name that he's known by. Fool by name and fool by nature. And he really does live up to that reputation. So David and his men, they've been in this region where Nabal's shepherds look after his flocks. And while they've been there, they've protected Nabal's men. In fact, we hear that from David, and we hear that from the shepherds themselves. In verse 7, David says, your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm. They missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Verse 15, one of the young men, one of the shepherds it seems, says, the men were very good to us. We suffered no harm. We did not miss anything when we were in the fields, as long as we went with them. So, they've been protecting Nabal's men. And the time of the shearing of the sheep comes around, and it would be traditional for there to be a feast at this time. And so David sends a very respectful delegation of 10 men. 10 men not to be threatening, it seems, but to show respect. You're worthy of having this great crowd of people coming to talk to you. And asking for some food in recognition of the blessing that they have been to Nabal. But as we said before, Nabal by name, Nabal by nature. They respectfully ask for some food. Verse 10, how does Nabal reply? And Nabal answered David's servants, who is David? Who is this son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from, well, I don't know where? Now, Nabal might have refused this request reasonably. There was no prior arrangement between David and Nabal, and so for David to come, he's asking for a boon or for a blessing, something he doesn't really deserve. He's not owed it. And so Nabal could have, politely refused the request. But instead, Nabal turns to insults. And notice how much he uses that word, my, right? A foolish and selfish man. Now, just because Nabal is foolish, it does not excuse what David does next. Verse 13. David said to his men, every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. See that repetition, right? There's a real sinister thing that's building up here. Clearly, David intends violence. And structurally, in this passage, something quite interesting happens. Because we read about David's response in verse 13. They all strap on their swords. But we also read about David's response to hearing what Nabal has said in verses 21 and 22, leaving a bit of a gap. If you look at verse 21, now David had said, past tense, surely in vain I've guarded this fellow, all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. So in verse 13, strapping on of swords, verse 21 and 22, we have this rash vow that David has made. It seems at the time that they're all strapping their swords on. So why is it being split up? Why have we got this gap in the middle? Why would the writer do this? Well, we're reminded that the Bible is a wonderfully, beautifully written book. It's not just dry commandments from God. It is a literary masterpiece. And we have here an example of what we might call a sandwich, or if you want to be technical, a chiastic structure, right? Two similar things happen on either end, kind of bookending it to draw our attention to what's in the middle. And it's always worth checking. You can see this all through Scripture. You find it in Old and New Testament. Whenever you see something happen slightly out of order, or something's repeated, with a gap in between, it's always worth going back and looking what's between, because the authors are trying to draw our attention to what's in the middle. So what's being emphasized here? Well, actually, this is a bit like a club sandwich, I suppose, because there's another layer of bread as well on the outside. In verse 13 to 17 and in verse 19, we have similar things happening. Verse 13 to 17, if you just look at it, verses 14 to 17, you can see that one of the servants is talking to Abigail. You see that? Then if you look at verse 19, she is given instructions to the servants or to the young men. So there's servants talking to her. she talks to the servants. So there's another layer to the sandwich. So what comes in the very middle? The point that's being emphasized in this passage, the thing that we must not miss, is verse 18. How does Abigail respond to the news that David and his men are on their way, swords strapped to their sides, with a terrible rash vow having been made? What does she do? Verse 18. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 5 seahs of parched grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs and laid them on donkeys. A great threat faces her house, including the servants. And so she responds to the situation by preparing a suitable gift, like the one that David had asked for from Nabal. You see, the wisdom of Abigail in acting so quickly, notice, uses the word, she made haste. The wisdom of Abigail is being highlighted to us. She's being presented in this passage as an admirable example. Nabal is a fool. David is acting like a fool. But Abigail is wise. She meets with David. She comes to his men, and she bows down before him. She speaks very gently and wisely and respectfully. Hannah, when she was reading this passage, you'll have noticed the word Lord is said an awful lot in Abigail's speech, right? Sometimes that's referring to Lord, capital L-O-R-D, referring to Yahweh, the special name of God. But 14 times she's referring to David as her Lord. Right? Very, very respectful speech that she's making. And we'll look at why her speech is so effective in just a moment. But for now, see that her words are indeed effective. Verse 32 to 34. She's made her speech. David says to her, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male." Abigail averts disaster that was about to come on her house because of her foolish husband. Well, eventually she tells Nabal about what's happened, and it seems to trigger some sort of a stroke. Second half of verse 37, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. David hears about this death, and having noticed how wise this Abigail is, he thinks, she'd be an excellent wife. And so he summons her to come to be his wife. But perhaps because Samuel is now gone, that wise man Samuel, David, lacking a good advisor, makes a mistake that's going to set up so much strife for his family because he marries another woman as well. Verse 43, David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel. The final verse of the chapter, verse 44, just have a quick look at it. You'll see the attention shifts back to Saul. And so it becomes about David and Saul and their conflict again. So that's the narrative in a real overview. We've glossed over a lot of detail there. A conflict, a point of great danger, strapping on their swords, a resolution, and a satisfying conclusion, albeit with a bit of a sting in the tail because of the mistake David makes by marrying another woman. And as we've looked through these verses, I think it's clear to us, both structurally, because of that sandwich, chiastic structure, and because of the events, the way they take place, had it not been for Abigail, things would have turned out very differently indeed. That's plain to see, isn't it? She completely changes the situation. She's a game changer. Well, why is that? And more importantly, what is God teaching us through her example? What are we to glean from this little legend? Well, there are lessons for us here in terms of reputation, gentle answers, good timing, and God's provision. So I've got 4 points, and I shall try not to talk too long on them. Firstly, A good name is better than fine perfume. A good name is better than fine perfume. That's Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 1. Your kitchen tap starts to spray water directly up into the air, soaking everything around. Who do you call? The car won't start. Who's your first point of call? Part of the ceiling falls in. The tire on your bike is flat. Your phone is out of charge and you don't have a charger. Unless you're one of those supremely competent people who's able to cope with nearly every situation and just gets on with it, we all have someone who we know we would call in those sorts of situations, right? Most of us have one or two names that we would call on in a crisis. I once started getting strobing lights across my eyes while running a youth group, while doing a youth talk, which was quite alarming. I hadn't had that before. Who did I ring? I rang my mate who was an optometrist, right? And he could reassure me and told me to go home because I was about to have a killer migraine, which I did. One of my groomsmen at our wedding, he's my go-to on everything cars because he is just, he knows what he's doing. He's supremely competent. We have those people, don't we? The people that we would trust, the people that we would go to. So when this terrifying prospect of David, who has killed his tens of thousands, people know that song well in Israel, David is approaching, their men with their swords strapped on. Who is it that the young men who've seen what Nabal has done turn to? Not to Nabal. After all, second half of verse 17, he's such a worthless man that no one can speak to him, they say. Who do they turn to? Abigail. Verse 14, but one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife. It is likely that Abigail has had to deal with the consequences of her husband's actions before. And so her reputation for wisdom means that the workers feel happy to come to her to ask her to do something, to intervene. She must be known to be competent. And she must also be known to be fair with them, because notice, they're not very polite about her husband at all, as I just read. He's such a worthless man that no one can speak to him. Well, they can trust her to be fair and to notice what the really important thing in that situation is. I think we all know people who, when given important news, perhaps in a slightly rushed way, perhaps in a slightly impolite way, focus more on the impoliteness than the actual important news itself. Abigail is not such a person. She sees through it. That sort of reputation is hard won and easily lost. As the preacher of Ecclesiastes says, a good name is better than fine perfume. Or Proverbs 22, verse 1, a good name is more desirable than great riches. Another striking feature of this passage is the number of times young men are mentioned. Perhaps later today you could go through with a highlighter and you could find all the references. 10 times young men are referenced during this conflict between David and Nabal. Our attention, it seems, is being drawn to the influence and example that David, Nabal, and indeed Abigail have on those who are younger than them. And there's a reminder for us in this, isn't there? We are being watched. Integrity matters a great deal. A good character is important. How we deal with stress, how we deal with unexpected bad news, the way we ask for help when we need it. Are we gentle? Are we demanding? The sort of emails we send, whether we do things in the right way or just try to get done what we want done. How we do all of those things has a huge influence on those younger than us. Indeed, not just those younger than us, but those who might look to us in some way for an example. Abigail actually protects David's reputation. He's been leading this band of young men for a good long while now, with great integrity. They've seen him with the opportunity to put down his great rival Saul, but he doesn't take it. He's led them as they've protected these shepherds. They've not taken anything for themselves. But in this moment of rash anger against Nabal, he could have wrecked his reputation forever. Abigail saves his reputation. In church, there's a mutual watching that goes on. It's not only church leaders who are watched. We are all learning from each other. The reality is that Christian behavior is not just influenced by what we read in Scripture, but by what we see our brothers and sisters doing. If I see someone doing that, then I think, oh, okay, that must be fine. And we should ask ourselves, what reputation do I have? What example do we set to each other? The Great Commission that Jesus gave to the church is not just to see people converted, but to make disciples. That is, to teach people what it is to live as a Christian. Not because what we do earns the title Christian, but because the gospel is so wonderful, it ought to shape us and change us completely. And disciple making is done more by being fruitful, faithful examples than it is achieved often through formal teaching. Value your reputation, not for your own glory, but for the good of God's people and for the glory of his name. A good name is better than fine perfume. Secondly, a gentle answer turns away wrath. A gentle answer turns away wrath. That's Proverbs chapter 15, verse 1. Anyone who's worked in the hospitality or the retail industry knows a certain type of customer very well. The type of customer who is determined, no matter what you do, to give you a very hard time. They're rude, they're impatient, they make inappropriate comments, maybe they get the rest of the table to laugh at you, if you're the waiter, something like that. Now, once in a while, it is possible to turn that kind of toxic customer around, right? A gentle answer with an enormous dose of humility can actually switch that situation. But the book of Proverbs is not a book of promises, but a book of wise guidance. So when it says a gentle answer turns away wrath, that's not an absolute solid guarantee that every time someone's angry with you and you're gentle, that it will stop their wrath. Some people are just too angry. And if you've worked in retail, then you know that to be true. Well, Abigail is a true example of the gentle answer that can turn away wrath. David is determined to kill. And not just a few people either. We've been told that Nabal is a wealthy man, so there's probably quite a lot of people who work for him, and he says he's going to kill every single male. That's a lot of wrath. That's a lot of anger. But Abigail turns him from it. And the way she does it is very, very wise. Verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she hurried, got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, "On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant." Now, insincerity is very transparent. We all know when someone's saying something humble, but they're not being humble about it. But clearly here, Abigail is full of humility. She is a wise woman. She means what she says. She even puts herself in the line of fire. On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Wow. Now, there's no guarantee that she's going to be able to turn David away from his path. But she gently makes the case for David to do so. Verse 26. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you, notice, the threat's still here. There's no guarantee David is going to be restrained yet. But she says, because the Lord has restrained you from your blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. She reminds him of the grave thing he's about to do, restrained you from blood guilt, while also suggesting that it's already happened. Now that's wise, isn't it? Her words are very, very calculated. Verse 27, and now let this present, that's the feast that she's hastily gathered together, let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. You might think she'd say, David, take this feast for yourself. But no, she says, take this feast for your young men. Why? She's subtly reminding David that he is responsible for these men, that he has a reputation to uphold. Her words are very wise. Verse 28, please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. She states that David is on the side of the Lord. She states, David, you're fighting the Lord's battles. Clearly going to go and kill Nabal and his men would not be fighting the Lord's battle. That would be his own. But she says, you fight the Lord's battles. And she's just drawing him back, making him see, no, you fight not for yourself, not for your own reputation, but for God's. Now look, it ought to have been enough for Abigail to go to David and say, David, stop being such a fool, and turn him around. But often, that kind of response only stirs up more anger. Abigail is adept in wisdom, a remarkable humility, an incredibly difficult thing to do. Well, how might this inform us? Well, when you're stirred up in anger, put yourself in the shoes of David for a moment. When you are stirred up in anger, do we listen to the voice of reason? Someone tries to reason us out of our bitterness or our anger. Do we actually listen? Or are we more determined to hold on to that than anything else? Do you insist, like I sadly so often do, insist on my fury being righteous when it really isn't? There is a better, more reasonable way. And when you're dealing with the angry person, be gentle. Young men like me are prone to getting very carried away. And when someone speaks back in anger, the anger intensifies. When someone speaks in humility and gentleness, the anger can, again, no guarantees, but can be quickly quenched. We should aspire to the example of Abigail, shouldn't we? What a remarkable woman she is. A good name is better than fine perfume. A gentle answer turns away wrath. Thirdly, there's a time to keep silence and a time to speak. A time to keep silence and a time to speak. That's from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 7. The right word at the wrong time can be just as bad as the wrong word at the right time. I say that again. The right word at the wrong time can be just as bad as the wrong word at the right time. That is to say, timing really matters. This is true of criticism. It's true of encouragement. This is the lesson that I'm needing to learn rather too often during Sophie and I's first year of marriage. Timing really does matter. I used to believe that so long as what you said was reasonable and rational, then you should just say it. I have learnt the error of my ways. Abigail, in her wisdom, shows us the importance of timing. For example, Abigail knows when something should be done quickly. So she hears from the young man that David is on his way. Verse 18, then Abigail made haste. Again, in verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she hurried. And then at the end of the passage, verse 42, when David summons her to come and be his wife, and Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey. But wisdom does not dictate that everything should be done as quickly as possible. The time that is your earliest convenience to tell someone something might not be the best time for that person. I know of a situation of a pastor who was preparing to preach a very difficult sermon on a very tricky passage. And he'd spent a good few hours beforehand praying, trying to get himself in the right place to preach such a difficult message. And just before the service started, someone came up to him and just started explaining to him something so banal and irrelevant. It completely threw him off. And he found it incredibly difficult to then preach that message. He'd spent a good few hours prayerfully praying to preach, and he was completely thrown off. Abigail doesn't just have one speed, haste, right? She sees the person, and she knows, is this the right time? She demonstrates the wisdom to know when it's the wrong time to say something, when she should wait. So after David has praised Abigail for her speech and for the gift that she's brought, we read in verse 36, "And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things." It would be no good to tell Nabal what has just happened while he's drunk. He wouldn't understand what she said, let alone remember it. She waits until the morning. I mean, it's a huge thing that's just happened. He's nearly died. All of his men have nearly been killed. They were on the brink of destruction. That seems like pretty urgent news, but Abigail realizes, actually, he can wait a moment. Actually, this is not the right time to tell him. She waits till the morning. How many emails are so urgent that they need to be sent as soon as they come to mind? How many work messages need to be replied to outside of working hours? Abigail was wise to know when to speak and when not to speak. How can we remind ourselves just to double check if something really needs to be said right now? Oh, that we had the wisdom of Abigail to know when to be fast and when to be slow. Of course, it's one thing when you're sending messages to someone. It's quite another when you're talking to someone face to face. Do you need to say everything in one go? Must it be said right away? Or, the other way, are you inclined to wait on something that really needs to be said urgently? Do you put off a conversation that will only get harder the longer that you wait? We should seek to walk in Abigail's wisdom, shouldn't we? A good name is better than fine perfume. A gentle answer turns away wrath. There is a time to keep silence and a time to speak. And finally, and most briefly, tools in the hand of God. I couldn't find a specific scripture reference for this one, which was really bothering me, but there we are. Tools in the hand of God. Abigail is highly admired in this passage for many reasons. But the greatest thing to admire is the way in which God uses her to stay David's hand. I mean, think about this. What if Abigail hadn't been here? What sort of path might this have set David on if he'd carried on with his rash vow? What sort of king would he have become? The kind of king who reacts violently to anyone who criticizes him. The consequences would have been terrible. And so, while it is right that we spend time looking at these little legends and what we can learn from them, and we should be quick to praise Abigail for her wisdom, we should be quicker still to praise the God who prepared her for such a moment as this. She's in a weirdly mismatched marriage. She is so wise, her husband's such a fool, and she's discerning. So she would have seen this fool coming. So perhaps this marriage wasn't a choice for her, maybe arranged marriage, we don't know. But God had so ordered events so that she would be married to Nabal, so that she, in the nick of time, would be able to prevent this catastrophe from unfolding. The fact that Nabal had prepared such a lavish feast, like the feast of a king, meant there was plenty of provision nearby for her to gather from and give a gift to David's young men. Do you see the way in which God has ordered and worked this situation? Theologically, we call this providence. I found a great definition of providence this week. Providence is the frequently mysterious, always interesting way in which God provides for his servants in their urgent needs. The frequently mysterious, always interesting way in which God provides for his servants in their urgent needs. And I'm sure many of you, like me, can tell stories of how just the right money came at just the right time to help with that thing. Now, I can tell you a story of how a nosebleed kept me from making a decision that would have had huge implications for my life. Massive. God led me by a nosebleed, right? That's the providence of God. When I first felt the call of God on my life to be a preacher, which was a scary and an exciting experience, one of the things that so comforted me about the uncertain future that would mean was a particularly incredible sunset. Now, that might sound a bit twee, right? For some of us who are inclined to a real kind of theological depth, the idea that a sunset would be so moving. And yet, that is true, isn't it? Right? God does speak through his creation. In the words of R.C. Sproul, there are no maverick molecules. And so, when it came to that experience for me, the clouds had formed in just such a way, at just the right time, so that the sun would cast that right sort of shadow with that stratified light that just blew me away in a sunset that I'd just never appreciated before. And as I considered the immense complexity of the weather that led to that moment, the evaporation, the condensation, water cycle, right? And I considered the just sheer magnitude of what it is God had ordered so that I would be stood where I was at that time. I was overwhelmed with the knowledge that God does and can and will provide through his mysterious providence. He assured me in a sunset, I can commit my life to him and have no fear. God provided Abigail at just the right time, in just the right circumstances. He does the same for us. Abigail was a life-changing providence for David. How great God is. He puts the right people in the right places at the right time for his eternal glory. And as I was preparing the sermon, Romans chapter 5 came to mind, which in verse 6 says this: while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. God's timing and his provision is always perfect. And so we can see from 1 Samuel 25, we can rest secure in his arms.